Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the second installment of the COP26 Climate Action Marathon, hosted by the Common Energy Impact Team. My name is Natalie, and I'm coming to you from Ute Arapaho land in Colorado. And just for some initial background, Common Energy is a community solar subscriber management organization, and the Impact Team is our youth-centered collective of clean energy advocates. The purpose of the COP26 Climate Action Marathon is to promote discussion about the upcoming United Nations Climate Conference in Glasgow and to increase awareness about local climate mitigation strategies. We're so excited to see everybody here today. So our Impact Team Manager, Beth, is going to be sending an attendance form into the audience. Once you've filled this out, please feel free to send your name, pronouns, and your location in the chat so we can all get to know each other a little bit better. So without further ado, let's get into our second topic. Today, we're going to be discussing the findings and warnings of the Ipcc report, which is being referred to as Code Red for Humanity. Here's a quick outline for our webinar today. First, we'll be providing some brief background information on the Ipcc and the role that it serves in global climate politics. Then we're going to jump into a quick analysis of the most recent report from the Ipcc Working Group 1, which will be followed by a look into the near-term and long-term consequences of climate change and the implications for this data considering the upcoming National Climate Conference, COP26. Finally, we're so excited to welcome Richard Kaiser, the CEO of Common Energy, who's going to be joining us in a discussion about facing the reality of climate change. For some general background, IPCC is an acronym that stands for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This is an independent and unbiased coalition of scientists developed by the World Meteorological Organization and adopted by the United Nations in 1988. The IPCC provides policymakers with regular scientific assessments on climate change, its implications, and suggestions for mitigation strategies. Every 7 years, the IPCC releases updated assessment reports, which include scientific information focused on the physical science of climate change, adaptation vulnerability, and climate change mitigation. This summer, the Ipcc released the 6th Working Group 1 report detailing the physical science of climate change, which we'll summarize in the next few slides. So the most recent report from the Ipcc includes some information about the current state of the climate, as well as that of what our future looks like, a risk assessment analysis, local adaptation suggestions, and recommended mitigation strategies. In summary, this report provides evidence for some pretty alarming facts. It is unequivocal that human activities are causing climate change as well as increased compound weather events. Our atmospheric CO2 concentrations are the highest that they've been in the past 2 million years. The global sea level is currently rising at the fastest rate in the past 3,000 years. Within the next 30 years, we're likely to exceed 1.5 degrees of warming compared to pre-industrial levels. And every single inhabited region of the Earth is already experiencing the effects of climate change. This is a quote from the co-chair of Ipcc Working Group 1, Valerie Masson-Delmotte. She says, "We now have a much clearer picture of the past, present, and future of climate change, essential for understanding where we're headed, what can be done, and how we can prepare." So to expand a little bit upon the findings of this report, I'd like to share this video clip from the Climate Pod, a podcast that covers the latest news on the climate crisis with a wide variety of world-renowned experts on justice, politics, science, culture, activism, and more. What I'd like to specifically highlight from this clip is the analysis of the record-breaking weather events related to the climate crisis, the discussion on adaptation and mitigation, and the potential to recover from global climate change, as well as the urgency of COP26. I also would like to invite our audience members to share any comments or questions in the chat while we watch.
The report claims that climate change is already transforming every inhabited region across the globe, driving observed changes in weather and creating widespread climate instability. What we are left with is a cruel cycle of unequal extremes, heavy precipitation in some areas, increased drought in others. Ecological and agricultural destruction abound. Meanwhile, fast melting Arctic ice is creating sea levels that aren't just rising, but surging at a rapidly accelerating pace. The annual rate of sea level rise increased by 46% from the first 70 years of the 20th century to the period between 1971 and 2006. But in the last 15 years alone, that rate has almost doubled. According to the report, sea levels will continue to rise for centuries to millennia due to continuing deep ocean warming and ice sheet melt, and will remain elevated for thousands of years. It's a consequence that poses an existential threat to entire low-lying island nations and major coastal cities alike. Heat waves, the globe's most deadliest weather event, will rapidly increase as well. Extreme heat events that prior to human influence occurred just once in every 50 years are now nearly 5 times more likely. Under 1.5 degrees Celsius warming, that will jump to 8.6 times per every 50 years, and under 2 degrees, almost 14 times per 50 years. Under 4 degrees of warming, 39 times per 50 years. We face an uncertain future, but a more disruptive one in coming years appears inevitable. Even under the best case scenarios put forth in the Ipcc report will include each of the next 3 decades as the hottest decades in recorded human history. The reason? The delayed consequences of more than a century of burning fossil fuels combined with ongoing emissions. As famed climate scientist Michael Mann said in January, we will have to reckon with the warming that's already been committed to.
Look, we have to adapt to those changes that are inevitable, that are already baked in, and we can still keep climate change to a level where we and other living things can adapt. But if we let it go much beyond the warming that we've already seen and the impacts that that has caused, it'll be beyond our adaptive capacity or the adaptive capacity of our biosphere of other living things. And so adaptation, yeah, we have to adapt to those changes that are now baked in, but we have to prevent those changes that we still can.
Carbon dioxide emissions alone have created 3/4 of a degree of warming since the Industrial Revolution. But methane, a more potent greenhouse gas in the short term, but an often overlooked source of global warming, has also accounted for about 1/2 degree of human-caused temperature increase. The proliferation of fossil fuels is bringing Earth to a boiling point. Global land temperatures are expected to increase until at least mid-century, even under the Ipcc's best-case scenario. And in the latest report, the Ipcc has outlined a potential future where our natural ocean and land carbon sinks will be less effective at slowing the accumulation of CO2 in the atmosphere. In fact, much of our land and ocean could transform into a net emitter of greenhouse gases, turning our own natural world against us. The delayed action on the climate crisis means there is no going back from some of the changes in the climate system. However, as the Ipcc notes, there remains a chance to actually reduce global temperature by the end of the century if the world takes steps to quickly end the burning of fossil fuels.
But what the climate models tell us is that the warming you get is pretty much a consequence of the cumulative emissions up to now. So if we stop burning carbon now, global surface temperatures plateau fairly quickly. And this is an important point because it's been long misunderstood. There is this continuing sort of misconception that the planet will continue to warm up for decades, even if we stop emitting carbon now. And that's based on sort of old-fashioned climate experiments, climate modeling experiments, where we treated CO2 as sort of a control knob, and you turn it up, and the planet warms up, and the oceans continue to warm even after you stop turning it up because of what we call thermal inertia. The oceans continue sort of their sluggish warming response to the greenhouse gases already in the atmosphere. So that continues for decades. And we call that committed warming, and it's true. But that's combated by the fact that if we stop emitting carbon, then there are natural sinks of carbon, like the terrestrial biosphere and the oceans in particular, that will continue to draw carbon out of the atmosphere. So when we do more realistic experiments now, where we treat carbon as an input, a flux, we put it into the atmosphere, but we let the climate system itself sort out the destiny of that carbon. then some of it builds up in the atmosphere, but some of it is taken up by the biosphere and the oceans. And if we stop burning carbon now, the oceans and the biosphere continue to take up carbon for decades into the future. They actually draw CO2 levels down. That offsets the so-called committed warming. And so you've got that balancing that, and the sum of them is a flat line. So global surface temperatures actually stabilize very quickly. That's really important because what it means is that there is agency, that our actions now have direct and immediate consequences.
It is not the first time a report like this has made waves. In 2018, the IPCC released its global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius report, which outlined dire consequences of a near future and led to an immediate upsurge in climate protest movements and pressure on public leaders. In 2013, the IPCC released its last assessment on the science of global warming, which served as a crucial document in driving the emission reductions and international climate commitments of the Paris Agreement in 2015. And as the leading global authority on climate science, the stakes couldn't be higher for the work of the IPCC in 2021. Later in the year, leaders from across the globe will meet in Glasgow, Scotland, at the UN's annual climate change event, the Conference of the Parties, better known as COP26. The meeting of the world's leading policymakers was set to take place in 2020, but was delayed a full year because of the COVID-19 pandemic. This year's COP event will not only bring critical updates to the Paris Agreement to revise strategies in order to meet emissions targets, but also marks the first major climate change conference, including leaders from all around the world, from the wealthiest nations to the global south, to discuss how to build a more sustainable world economy, still reeling from the pandemic. So how will world leaders act to avoid the worst consequences of the climate crisis in this critical year? It is yet to be seen. As for the IPCC, additional parts of its report will be released in the coming months, whatever our future holds. Many of its outcomes will be greatly affected by what is understood, and even more importantly, what is done and what remains of this year alone.
So like I said, that video is from the Climate Pod, a really highly renowned climate podcast. And I just think it had some really incredible information that they presented much more efficiently than I ever could. So I just want to bring everyone's attention to this graph that was referred to in the previous video. This is the IPCC's projection for shared socioeconomic pathways, considering the future of global temperature change as influenced by the increased concentration of CO2. So as the professional in the video mentioned, that there is this opportunity to have a kind of flat line for our CO2 emissions if we stop emitting right now. What's important to note here is that there are only two scenarios that we can have these emissions decreased to the point where we can have below 2 degrees of Celsius warming. And also that while we're in this kind of near-term gray area of, the beginning of this climate crisis, it's not some far off apocalyptic disaster that we're waiting for. There are people all around the world that are currently experiencing the effects of climate change today. So let's quickly review some of the near-term events related to climate change. Here we have a map of the world, including selected significant climate anomalies and events from June of 2021, so this past June. This is presented by NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. This graph includes notable climate events such as record-breaking heat waves, tropical storms, and Arctic and Antarctic ice depletion recorded in June of this year. What's also important to note is that although we're experiencing these extreme weather events and catastrophes, we're still just at the tip of the iceberg of the climate catastrophe. So now I'll pass it over to Fatima, who's a longtime member of the impact team, to tell us more about the long-term consequences of climate change according to the IPCC. The next few slides will include graphics from an organization called Climate Nexus, and Beth is going to send the full report of the article in case anyone would like to review that.
Thank you, Natalie. The influence of human-caused global warming is being felt by around 85% of world's population and 80% of world's area. The frequency and severity of extreme weather events have increased around the world. The IPCC Special Report on Climate Change this year discusses long-term consequences of global warming through climate modeling and simulations that have projected changes in surface temperature under various greenhouse gas emission scenarios, as Natalie discussed in the previous slides, scenarios of low emissions, high emissions, and very high emissions. And that temperature increase ranges anywhere between 1.5 to 4 degrees centigrade in near future and centuries to come. Based on these models and projections, we will discuss the resulting impacts on our basic resources and the environment in next couple of slides by Climate Nexus. Impacts on food. A minimum emission scenario causing 1.5 degree temperature rise is projected to impact the production of staple grains like wheat, rice, and maize. And in case of extreme scenario with a temperature rise of 4 degrees centigrade, the world could face food insecurities. Next slide, please. Water is one of our most precious resources, and world is already struggling with water crisis. And an additional 1.5 degree temperature could mean increased water shortages, especially in the subcontinents of Asia, Australia, and the Mediterranean region. The extreme 4 degree temperature rise is projected to cause more severe drought conditions around the world. Next slide, please. The flora and fauna is also under the impact of human-caused warming, and even the minimum projected increase of 1.5 degree can cause risk to various living beings. For example, severe degradation of every 9 out of 10 coral reefs, and subsequent degree could cause a total extinction of reefs around the world. The extreme 4 degree increase due to high emission scenario is anticipated to cause local extinction of almost half of plant and animal species, threatening the food chain and the living environment. Next slide, please. Coastal communities around the world are already threatened by sea level rise, and the further increase of just 1.5 degrees could mean a sea level rise of about 48 centimeters, displacing 46 million people around the world, where the subsequent increase could lead to up to 7 meters of sea level rise. And in extreme emission scenario, there is a projected sea level rise of 9 meters, displacing around 470 to 760 million people at risk. And just to give a reference, 9 meters mean around a 3-story building. So you can imagine at this rate, some island nations could be totally underwater. These impacts clearly indicate and underline to call for climate action now and address this human-induced global warming. At this point, I want to pass the presentation to our impact team mentor, Lauren, to continue the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fatima, for going over all of that. Now that we have a more clear understanding of the real threats that we're facing, we're going to talk briefly about what this implies for the upcoming International Climate Conference, that is COP26. So this is a quote from Climate Policy Coordinator Teresa Anderson from ActionAid International. In summary, Teresa is calling upon wealthy industrialized nations to be held accountable for being the primary contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. She demands that rich countries take leadership in reducing global emissions, as well as supporting less developed nations who will be affected first and worst by the climate crisis. So as one of the largest global emitters of CO2 and a leading global economy, the US holds great responsibility here. As established by the Paris Agreement of 2015, the US has committed to reduce net greenhouse gas emissions to 50 to 52% below 2005 levels by the year 2030. And in order to reduce emissions, we need to address the source of them, which is outlined in the graph you see to the right, produced by the EPA. And we would love to hear from our audience through a poll that we prepared for you that Natalie will start now. If you could just select your answer to the question, which is based on this chart, which sector of the economy is most critical in addressing our efforts to reduce CO2 emissions? So while you guys answer that, I'm just going to talk a little bit more about what you see about the 5-year accountability cycle. So as we approach COP26, we are also approaching the deadline for the 5-year accountability cycle established alongside the NDCs of the Paris Agreement, which was delayed from last year because of COVID. This is an extremely critical moment for the US to increase our ambitions for CO2 emissions reduction and do everything we can to change the trajectory of climate change. So I'm seeing a few answers in here, a few for transportation, some for electricity, some for industry. It looks like 40% of you are saying, or 47% of you are saying transportation. 41% are saying electricity, and 12% are saying industry. And I believe you guys should be able to see that on your screen right now. So thank you for answering that poll. We're going to talk a little more about this with our guest speaker, but before we do that, we wanted to give a brief introduction to the work that we do here at Common Energy. So here at Common Energy, we work with climate mitigation through a state program called Community Solar, which incentivizes the addition of solar farms to local utility grids. And with Community Solar, you no longer need to install rooftop solar panels to support clean energy. What's actually really cool about it is anyone that has a utility account can join a local solar farm for free and end up saving money due to state incentives. So a little bit about how it works. First, a community solar farm will convert energy from the sun into clean electricity. That clean electricity is then connected to the local utility, replacing fossil fuels. Next, that electricity will flow as normal through the broader electrical grid. And finally, homeowners, renters, businesses, basically anyone that signs up for community solar will begin to receive savings every single month on their electricity bill, again, due to state incentives. In some more exciting news, just last week, the U.S. Department of Energy announced a new national community solar partnership target to enable community solar to power 5 million homes by 2025 and create $1 billion in energy bill savings. So with all of this in mind, we're now going to transition into our discussion today featuring our guest speaker, Common Energy CEO, Richard Kaiser. And I'm going to pass it over to Natalie, who's going to give a brief introduction and start off our discussion.
Thank you so much, Lauren, and thank you to Fatima as well for sharing all that important information with us. We're so excited today to welcome Richard Kaiser as our guest speaker to talk about more the reality of climate change. Richard is a graduate of MIT and a former Wall Street analysis who was previously senior analyst and head of the technology startup group at Stanford C. Bernstein in New York. His analysis have been featured in Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, Bloomberg, Forbes, and energy publications around the world. In 2007, he authored a seminal analysis on the implications of climate change for investable technology themes. In 2011, his analysis of US electricity pricing and solar energy cost curve correctly predicted the rise of distributed energy in the United States. In 2018, he founded Common Energy, a leading community solar provider. Thank you so much, Richard, for joining us today. We're so excited to have you. And I think we can jump into our first discussion question. So it's clear that the United States has a tremendous responsibility not only to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but also to show global leadership in addressing the climate crisis. What do you think should take top priority as we address reducing our CO2 emissions? And do you think we're doing enough in terms of climate change mitigation leadership?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for that warm and thoughtful introduction, Natalie. I'll have to work on shortening that for me in the future. And thanks to everybody for taking the time to join this exciting event. Before I answer that question, I want to come back to something that Professor Mann said about the temperature stabilizing. That is still a disaster scenario because at the current temperature, the Arctic ice is melting and the permafrost is thawing. And so even if there is a stabilization of temperature, which is a new concept that he correctly is kind of updating, that is not a great outcome, okay? So the reason why I mention that is because it heightens the urgency of the situation. The second point is that there are many ways to represent, so let me answer the question a little bit long-windedly, but perhaps in the best manner. There are many ways to represent the sources of climate greenhouse gas emissions. One of the ways was just shown in this particular chart presentation, which was by industry, agriculture, transportation, etc. And when you do it in that way, it creates the impression that there are lots and lots of things that need to happen for there to be a meaningful reduction of climate change. However, that exact same graph or pie chart could be represented by emission source. And in doing so, 80% of that will be one activity, and that is combusting fossil fuels. Okay, and so to reverse engineer, and this is interesting because there's actually a Bill Gates video. Bill Gates, if you have endless resources, you can create lots of things, and you don't necessarily need to run them by experts to verify that they're right or not. But he has used that exact pie chart to split it up and say, well, electricity is only 25% of the problem, therefore we've got to work on the other 75% as well. And that's actually dead wrong, because all of the other climate mitigation solutions are dependent on electrification alternatives, which therefore drive electricity as the underlying, the foundational solution. So let me just make clear what I mean there. So, or thank you for showing this. So on the left is the US electricity grid today. It generates around 4 petawatt hours. That's easier than putting 15 zeros there. So petawatt hour is times 10 to the 15th. So the electrical grid generates around 4 petawatt hours, of which only about 40%, 1.5 of that comes from non-CO2 emitting sources, which includes nuclear. Okay. So in order for us to solve all of these other climate problems, we need to electrify transportation. Okay. And if you electrify transportation without cleaning up the electrical grid, then you are just going to shift the problem, shift the emissions from the transportation sector to electricity. That doesn't solve anything in isolation. Similarly, if you electrify heating and cooking and you don't clean up the electrical grid, then you're just shifting the problem from combustion at the source, cooking, to the combustion for the electricity. And so this was something, an analysis I published in the spring, showing basically that the US electrical grid was going to need to grow by at least 50%. And that includes basically replacing more generation than currently exists today. Okay, and so so subsequent to this publication, the Department of Energy and NREL both separately published 100-page studies basically confirming what I had written before. And so that was a nice boost. So to come to the question and answer it directly, the number one thing that the US needs to do, of course, these can happen simultaneously because the problem's so intractable and the speed is so important. But the number one thing we need to do is dramatically expand the clean electricity infrastructure in the country. And that the reason for that, again, is because that is the foundational solution for all of the other, it's the enabler for all of the other climate mitigation strategies, even reforestation. If you are going to invest massively in reforestation, you would have to either get trucks in there or drones in there to do the planting. And what's going to power those trucks and drones? Okay. Needs to be clean electricity. So even things that might seem agricultural in nature will need electrification. So understanding that, then the next layer is, okay, well, what are the barriers to that infrastructure? And that is really 3 things. Permitting, so unblocking permitting, in particular land rights and right-of-way. Interconnection queues, which are blocked up at the utility level, which need to be unlocked. And then number 3 is broad investment in high voltage DC lines, like 345 volt lines that are necessary for larger utility scale connections. So I know that was a bit of a long-winded answer, but I hope that clarifies kind of the role of electricity in solving and mitigating climate in all of the other sectors.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this analysis that you created is really helpful for understanding why that's so important. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. So this question is pretty related to the first one, but based on this information presented by the IPCC, what kind of action items should be taking center stage as we approach COP26 conference in Glasgow?
Yeah, so so the way to think about climate change solutions is really as a time problem, as opposed to an innovation problem. Okay, about 80% of the solutions for climate change are known today. Okay, and so once you understand that, it's really about speed. Okay, it doesn't mean you shouldn't work on the 20%. Okay, but since we have a speed problem, a timing problem, then we need to move as quickly as we can. And so, so those strategies differ based on a country's kind of economic and economic development condition. So, for example, in the developing world, deforestation is a massive contributor to their carbon emissions. So in Indonesia and Brazil, for example, the whole scale raising of those forests in the Amazon and elsewhere are massive drivers of climate emissions, whereas they aren't in the developed world. So in the United States, that land use change is a sink, okay? Not a positive emitter, but a negative contribution. So to make things simple, in the developed world, electricity and transportation are the two top things to electrify and decarbonize as quickly as possible, not just because they are the largest, but also because your bang for your buck in terms of kilowatt hours versus CO2 is greatest there. And I want to just pause for a moment again, at the risk of having too long-winded of an answer. What I mean by that is right now we have very, very limited kilowatt hours of clean electricity. That is a rare commodity. A clean kilowatt hour is very, very rare today. And there's a vast shortage of them. So each one of those that you make, you want to offset as much CO2 as possible with that kilowatt hour, okay? And so your greatest impact in doing such is in the transportation sector, okay? Far, far down the line, a list of things that you could use that kilowatt hour for is generating clean hydrogen, for example. At some point in the future, we should generate clean hydrogen with electrolyzers for industrial use, for sure. But it is so wasteful that to use kilowatt hours today to do that would be madness. And that's why there's a very vocal kind of opposition to that in LinkedIn and other knowledgeable channels about this idea. So to come back to the question, the solution set varies, but in the developed world, the top items are electricity infrastructure and transportation. And in the developing world, really, you need to look at land use and other incentives to, not burn down stuff.
Thank you so much. Really great answers. Okay, so our next question is about a new term that's come up recently called climate doomism. So this recent report is being referred to by many as a code red for humanity. And once we understand the facts of the climate crisis, it can be really easy to fall into climate doomism, which is the general lack of hope for the future for our planet that leads to inaction. So how can we effectively communicate the urgency of the climate crisis in a way that inspires action instead of panic?
Yeah, well, I'm not necessarily the greatest communicator for technical items. I think I'm okay, but for these types of matters, maybe less. So let's come back to some of the things in the video. Okay, so in the immediate term, like, it's not like all of society faces collapse next year, right? So it's not like an asteroid is going to strike the planet. Well, that could of course happen, but not any known to us at this time, at least. Okay. And so there is time to have an impact. And on the positive side, let's come back to this discussion again, the point I made in answering the second question, which was the previous question, which was this is a time issue. So on the one hand, you have all of these negative effects: population growth, increased energy consumption per population, and the resulting infrastructure right now, which is currently based on fossil fuels. And so fossil fuel emissions are certainly going to continue to be very, very high for a long time. Okay, so those create a negative cycle that's what one would say, which is well, self-reinforcing or forcing. Okay. On the positive side, we're now able to harness technology and AI and other robotics, other things that we weren't able to do to solve problems with incredible speed. Okay, it's not well known, I don't think, that it took Moderna approximately 4 hours to have a working vaccine after China published the genome. Okay, 4 hours, as opposed to like years, is what the previous one. Now, of course, it wasn't approved for use, but it took them about 4 hours to design something that could attack, the spike protein. Okay, so you have the potential to have, an accelerating, we see already a very accelerating deployment of clean energy, and we see glimpses of hope in other countries, like the penetration of electric vehicles in Norway, for example. And you can see a replacement cycle starting with Tesla's success and others. And so what we basically have are two countervailing cycles that are at different speeds. Okay, one is the climate cycle, which is having temperature and biodiversity loss combined, accelerating. And then the other is our ability to solve problems is picking up very quickly. And so, so the latter provides hope, but it remains unclear which of these will win, or which will, what will be the steady state once the two kind of combine together. And so, so since there is hope, the way that I, rather than get lost in, hopelessness and just drink all day, it's good to direct energy toward being part of the solution. And so that's the personal choice that I've made, is try to get as many clean energy projects connected to the grid as quickly as possible.
That's a really perfect transition into our next question, which is just to tell us a little bit more about your experience and the mission of Common Energy. So how has your work in the energy sector illuminated some of the challenges and opportunities that we face in the climate crisis?
Yeah, so, well, I think everybody knows what Common Energy does. We help connect new clean energy projects. Community solar, it's a type of clean energy project, to the electrical grid. Those electrons have first priority to the grid and thereby displace fossil fuel electrons. So the grid actually becomes cleaner. What I mean by that is a higher percentage of clean electrons than previously, which means lower emissions per kW, as a result of our work. So that's a direct impact. That's great. What it's taught me, one of the big things is that it's really not a technical barrier, it's a people barrier. It's the utilities, it's the policies, it's the government regulators, even those that seemingly are supposed to help you. And so I actually believe that using more authoritative manners, from a federal perspective, from a government perspective, are warranted here. And in many countries, that power exists more centrally within the federal government. In the United States, it can be used under extraordinary circumstances. But let me just give you an example. It was about a decade ago that Angela Merkel, maybe it was even 15 years ago, Angela Merkel just announced one day that all German nuclear facilities would close by like 5 years. And I was in Germany at the time and I was like, what? Like somebody, just one person can do that? And so, so here you're going to need a little bit more muscle to solve this problem in the time frame that is required. And so I'm in favor of more aggressive federal action, both in the form of incentives and also in the form of unblocking connection points in the electrical grid.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, if anyone's interested in supporting that as well, I believe Action for the Climate Emergency is currently organizing a campaign to call President Biden to declare a national climate emergency, which would hopefully initiate more of those incentives and reduce the blockages for clean energy development. So thank you so much to Richard for joining us today. That concludes our discussion part of this webinar. Just wanted to briefly go through how, if you're interested in signing up for community solar, it's a really simple process. It's completely online. You can use this link that Beth is going to send in the chat. And there are so many reasons to sign up, including everything that we've been talking about today regarding the climate crisis. But if you do choose to sign up for Common Energy, you can prevent approximately 100,000 pounds of carbon emissions every year, which is equivalent of planting 200 trees. You'll also be saving money every month due to state incentives, and it's completely free to sign up. You can also cancel at any times. We are active in 9 states, including the states listed on the screen here. So if you live in one of these states and you pay a utility bill, you likely qualify for community solar, and you can sign up today to reduce your carbon emissions immediately. So with that, thank you so much to everyone for joining us today. We're so happy to have so many people come on and engage with us. So I wanted to open up to some questions to see if anyone on the call today has any questions for us or for Richard regarding any of the information presented today. And I will go ahead if we have someone raising a hand. Here we go. Go ahead, Chuck.
Okay, yeah, I actually put the question in the chat as well, because I read a very interesting article in the Washington Post today talking about the real challenge of transmission lines and suggesting that rather, obviously we have to build new transmission lines, but is the concept of more distributed generation also a possible solution to get, because you're talking about this 50% increase in electric generation, because I've always worried about where we're going to plug in all the electric cars, and clearly that's going to be necessary as well. So how do you deal with that transmission line issue, because it's serious? I have to unmute.
Well, a great question, Chuck. I mean, this is exactly what I was speaking of. It comes down to interconnection permits and transmission lines. And right now, the US electrical grid is broken into 3 subsegments, which in turn are broken into, I think, 9 or 10 sub-segments. So East, West, and ERCOT are the 3 that exist today. And then within them you have PGM and the New York ISO and Cal ISO and all the different subcomponents. And so I think that there needs to be a lot more forceful action from the federal government to accelerate those breakdowns and or to accelerate basically the directives of what needs to happen. And at the heart of the matter is actually so forget my analysis. Let's just use what the government itself has published. So either NREL or the DOE, take your pick. They both say that we need 7 petawatt hours of electricity. Both of them say that, okay? So then what is needed is an effective planning process throughout the whole country of where is that going to come from? Where are we going to build it? How are we going to build a grid that functions with two-way flows for 7 petawatt hours? That needs to be front and center, like war room type development effort of the US government at this point. And that's the powers and that could be bestowed through the president through executive orders and other means would be the way to accelerate that. You're absolutely on the key part of the equation.
We have some more questions coming through the chat. Debbie says, what do you think it will take for the government to actually act on our proposals? For example, planning process, incentivizing utilities to adopt clean energy, et cetera.
It's going to take too long. That's the problem. That's in essence, people act in their own economic interests, especially corporations. People less so. People are more emotional and crazy. Myself included, we're emotional species. But corporations tend to act based on their economic interest, right? And so if you've invested billions of dollars in coal and natural gas infrastructure, and you borrowed money to build that plant, and you're paying back that loan with the sales of natural gas, electricity generated by natural gas, and someone says, well, stop, you will say, well, if I stop, I'm going to default on my loan, and then I'm out of business, right? And so there's no way to have a voluntary system for within an acceptable time frame, in my opinion. So it's going to need a lot more forceful action, and that's really where we're stuck right now.
Thank you. And I completely agree. It's very frustrating to see how slowly things move through the government. So Dana has a question as well. In order to realistically stay in the best scenario from the graph earlier, how quickly do these changes need to be enacted?
Well, it's unclear. And this is the reason why it's unclear. Because you have essentially two. I'm going to attempt to give you a very simplified climate model in your head right now. Imagine on the left-hand side is a circle of activity, and those are anthropogenic, man-made sources of climate emissions, which we showed here: electricity, transportation, agriculture. These are going along, and then in the middle, okay, so that's one loop, one like this. Okay? And then right next to it are the natural cycles, which sometimes have nothing to do with the human forced cycles, but can be activated by the human activity. And what I mean by that are the self-reinforcing pieces of increased temperature means melting ice, which means less albedo, which means warming seas, which means higher temperature, which means forest fires, which means more carbon release, which means higher temperatures. And so the concept of runaway climate change, what that means is that you sufficiently catalyze the natural cycles such that even if you stop all man-made carbon emissions, the natural cycles have been sufficiently catalyzed to self-perpetuate. And if that happens, that will go on until those natural cycles find some other countervailing source, which could be 100 million years or longer, right? Because now you're dealing with geological timescales, right? And so it's actually not clear at this point if we have sufficiently catalyzed those cycles or not. That's unclear at this time, and so so we don't have a good answer. Absent that, we need to go as fast as we can, basically.
Yeah, well, thank you so much to Richard and everyone for joining today. We're at the end of our time right now. It's 3:50 Eastern time. So if anyone has other engagements that you need to get back to, please feel free to do so. I'm just going to leave this screen up in case anyone's interested in checking out our website. We have our next COP26 Climate Action Marathon webinar coming up on October 28th, where we will be talking about the hot topics of COP26. So we're going to be going through all the different discussions that will be happening during this upcoming climate conference and kind of just giving everyone some more context for what those mean and what we can expect moving forward. So if you have more questions, please feel free to stay on. We can continue this conversation, but if not, I really just want to say thank you so much to everyone for coming, and I hope you have a really great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay. All right, I will stop the recording and call it a day. Thank you so much, everyone, and I hope to see you at our next event. Bye.